An honor and delight to be here with Professor Samuel Fleischacker, who is LAS Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Director of Religious Studies there as well. And our topic today is relevant to his 2011 Oxford published book, Divine Teaching and the Way of the World. So thanks for taking some time to talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So to start with our subject of the way of the world and the way of the Jews, what do you mean by the way of the world?
So I'm translating a Hebrew phrase that is used a fair bit actually in rabbinic writings, derech eretz. And it means a lot of different things, but it's centrally used to mean behaving like a decent human being, behaving like a mensch, as people say, yes, with the Yiddish expression. And to an extent that I actually didn't even appreciate myself until I began working on it more intensely, the rabbis understood derech eretz, this way of the world, as basic, perhaps in some ways more basic to being a decent human being, obviously, to basic to who we are, in some ways more basic than the Torah, or at least a kind of ground on which the Torah needed to be built. And I use it more generally in my book to include all aspects of who we are in terms of seeking truth, in terms of being a good human being, in terms of politics, that are not specifically Jewish, that we share with humanity in general.
Right, so this notion of derech eretz kadma laTorah, that it proceeds in some sense. And now, what standard is that based on? Is that based on sort of a sophisticated notion of ethics? Is that based upon a subjective societal understanding of what it means to be, a mensch within society?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm a moral philosopher, moral and political philosopher. That's what I do for a living. We try to figure out what is morality based on, right? And it turns out, as you know, that philosophers have argued about this for 2,000, 3,000 years without really settling on any particular conclusion, right? From Plato onwards, it's one of the main things we debate, and we have a lot of different views about how you derive morality, and to this day, those debates aren't settled. If you look in ancient and medieval theory, you have what's called natural law theory, which tries to derive from reason or from our nature as animals. And maybe as animals we need certain kinds of ethical standards in order to live together as a society, otherwise we kill each other. That seems true, but it doesn't give you much in the way of ethics. You certainly have to be very nice to not kill each other. Maybe our reason itself tells us that we're supposed to do certain things. The great thing about the Jewish tradition is we don't really try to derive it. There isn't a rich tradition of philosophy trying to analyze where derech eretz comes from. It's as if the rabbis want to say, you know what, guys, this is obvious. This is something you should know. And in fact, in a wonderful Midrash that I like to cite, a man who seems to know very little, certainly none of the traditional Jewish sources, doesn't know Torah, doesn't know Mishnah, doesn't know Gemara. He comes to have a meal with well-known Rabbi Yanai, and Rabbi Yanai, when he learns how ignorant he is, wants to kick him out of the house. He even says, a dog has eaten of Yanai's food. And the man says to him, you're depriving me of my inheritance. And he says, what inheritance is that? The Rabbi Yanai says, what inheritance is that? And he says, well, Torah is supposed to be the inheritance of the children of Jacob. Somehow he knows enough Torah to quote a verse. Not the children of Yanai. So the Torah is mine as well. You should teach me. And Yanai says, well, why do you deserve to eat with me? And he says, never in my life have I repeated slander, evil talk. And whenever I've seen two people trying to fight with one another, I've tried to bring them together. And the rabbi immediately concedes and apologizes and says, how could I have called you a dog when you have such derech eretz? So what does that mean? It suggests that derech eretz consists in modes of kindness and of keeping society together that anybody who's been properly socialized will recognize.
Right.
You don't need a sophisticated philosophical theory.
And those two examples are fascinating, because one seems to be a little bit more character based, and one a little bit more society based. I mean, they're both social. They're both social, but So that's fascinating. So one might say, as we've heard before, that all the wisdom you need in the world is in the Torah. All the empires will fall, and the zeitgeist is always evolving, and so just root yourself in what is eternal and good. So why would you say it's important for Jews actually to learn from Gentiles and not just from our own textual history?
What I love about these texts, like the one we were just talking about, is that they are part of what we mean by Torah. Mm-hmm. So it's as if Torah itself is teaching us to reach beyond Torah. Mm-hmm. And there's another text, which is a wonderful commentary on Parshat Yitro, where we get the Ten Commandments, where we get the Torah, right? Mm-hmm. What is that parsha named for? It's named for a non-Jew. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Famously, Jethro, Yitro, is not supposed to be a Jew. Not even his daughters marry Moses, but he doesn't convert. In fact, he goes back to Midian as a priest. Right.
Well, there's a debate about whether he converts or not, right?
Yeah, there is. Okay, but at least...
But according to many accounts, he goes back. He's basically...
The most obvious reading of the Torah would suggest that he's a non-Jew.
Yes, exactly. 100%,
right?
Yeah.
And Moses needs to get advice from a non-Jew before we get the Torah.
Yeah.
Before the Torah, the Ten Commandments are given, he tells Moses about how to organize the judges, and he gives some other advice. And there's a lot of commentary about that. That, if you wanted a clear sign that the Torah itself is telling you, don't rely just on me. Look outside. That's a wonderful kind of proof text. Right. So, but why more theoretically do we need to do it? Well, first of all, I don't think one can understand anything unless one understands it in context. Mm-hmm. Any human text, any human civilization, you have to have comparisons, you have to see how human beings work generally in order to interpret it. Right? So in that sense, very obviously, Derech Eretz Kadma LaTorah. It is the basis on which we understand what the Torah means. Secondly, the claim we make, again, even in our own Torah, is that we are supposed to be a light to the nations. Other nations will say this is a wise and understanding people in Devarim. How are we going to do that if our standards of goodness are unintelligible to other people, or they even regard us as not good humans? We have a mission, we have a job to do, and we are supposed to be, in an important sense, sort of God's emissaries or God's representatives on earth. We can't carry that out unless we understand what human beings are generally like, and we live up to standards of decency that any human being can recognize.
And it's very powerful. And in addition to the prescriptive, just on a descriptive level, it feels like we can't live in illusion that we haven't always been doing this, even if it's been passively. Obviously, intellectually, everyone from Maimonides look at Shmona Prakim through Al-Farabi and whoever else. In every other case, we're never a culture separate from the rest of culture. But to do it more intentionally is... So what would that look like? Like, how would Jewish learning and Jewish education fundamentally be different from many models we see today if we took this really seriously?
Well, I have to say, in some places... what I'd like to see is being done. I suspect very much that the Valley Beit Midrash is one of those places. And the school where my children went, the day school in Chicagoland, the Jewish high school there. Just recently, I was at an event there for incoming or potential parents, and the Rav Beit Sefer, the main rabbi in the school, was talking to the parents about how the students in his Gemara class saw connections between what they were learning in the Talmud and what they were studying in English class and when they were reading Joan Didion. And he was saying to them, bring them together. Bring Joan Didion and the Talmud together. Now, in a lot of ways, that's, as you said, this is exactly what we've been doing for a long time. We've brought Judaism together with Aristotle, together with Arab sources, Muslim sources, together with Kant in the 19th century. The idea that you can be a devout, committed Jew and at the same time a humanist, more broadly, is well understood. But I would like to see in every yeshiva in the world, if you read Maimonides, also read Aristotle. He was reading Aristotle. We deprive ourselves if we don't see him in the context of debates between Aristotle and Plato. I had a Seder at my house in which everybody read the Symposium first, because it said at least that the Haggadah is modeled in various ways on the Symposium. So we were comparing the Haggadah to Plato throughout, and there were all kinds of very interesting connections. Now, were they literal historical connections? I don't know. But it made for a rich Seder. I don't think every Seder has to be like that. Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And yet there seems to be a trend in looking at some of the modern Orthodox thinkers of the 20th century to have to skip back a few hundred years to find any intellectual value in certain thinkers. And it feels like part of the requirement here is to be in touch with the thought of our time as well, right?
Right. Look, I think we're living in a time in which certainly committed Judaism of any kind, observant Judaism, feels very under siege.
Yes. Right.
We feel like many Jews are giving up on it, mocking it. It's very easy to assimilate, to drop it altogether. And in reactions, what tends to happen is the dialectic, right? In reaction, a lot of people in the observant community pull back and say, not only is the Torah important, but it's the only thing that's important, and just skip that outside stuff because it's going to distract you. And the subtext is, it's going to pull you away.
Right.
And I think we have to be less afraid that it's going to pull you away. I think we have to understand that these two things can work together. Now that means contemporary as well as stuff in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the, and I think this is what you were alluding to as well, one of the models I think of this as being so powerful for me, and I wonder if it resonates for you as well, was Professor Tamar Ross's book, Expanding the Palace of Torah. In this, building on Rav Kook's idea there, this notion that, okay, fine, something is not in that textual tradition, but Torah becomes greatened by bringing new ideas into it, in relationship to it. So swing the other way. So we understand there's a problem of building higher walls, and closing our ears to the world and not engaging more deeply intellectually. But what about the argument on the other side that says really all we need are human values? Why should I be invested at all in these human ethics are what I need? The specific way of the Jews. Why do I need that in terms of serving God and being a good citizen in the world?
Yeah, good question, and of course that's what often comes up. That's actually one reason why the observant establishment is often so entrenched. They're afraid that what's going to happen is you study all these other things and say, I don't need Torah, I can just read Immanuel Kant or David Hume or become a good cosmopolitan or whatever, right? Look, there's an argument that is in fact respected in the way of the world, not just the way of the Jews, that being a universal human being is kind of empty. There are certain moral standards and principles of truth-seeking that all human beings share and must share, that you need in order to bring a society together. But we're each distinctive people. Yeah. And if you lose that side of the picture, you lose what matters most to people in their lives. And this is actually a central theme in the book that you mentioned that I wrote, The Divine Teaching in the Way of the World. We lose our particularity, as people might say technically. I'm a historical being. I grew up in a certain family, in certain contexts, in certain societies, with certain loves and tastes and interests and concerns and worries that have to do with my particular historical location. That can't be lost in my relationship to God. It can't be lost in what I take seriously. It never is lost. We care a lot about that. And the Jewish tradition has always stressed that. We don't say that only Jews are part of God's plan. We don't say that everyone has to become Jewish. We do say that God had a specific relationship with the Jews based on their history, their particular family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, going into slavery, coming out of slavery. Even if that's somewhat mythical, the idea is that our history matters, and our telling of our history matters, and that God speaks to us through that. Right. That's true for peoples across the world, and in fact, I think that's one of the things that we have to teach, that universal human nature is important, but it's not enough.
Okay, so just to push back slightly, or to understand more deeply, what I hear you saying is that it might be empty, there might be a human desire or need for particularity, but what would be the ethical case for particularity, in the sense that it seems oftentimes particularism muddies the waters of reason, and it muddies the waters of our universal obligations. What would be the ethical case to understand this?
So, look, the irony is, I was just sketching a universalist case for not being so universalist, right? Universalist case for particularity.
Yeah.
All of us,
Yeah, exactly,
all
right.
human beings across the world value their particularity,
Yeah.
value their history, value their specific ties and interests and so forth. And if it matters to them, if it matters to their happiness, if they define their freedom in terms of their specific history, social ties, practices, etc., then if you care about everybody's happiness and freedom, you've got to care about their particularity. Now that's, as I said, a kind of universalist case for non-universalism. But I think that makes sense. It is a bit paradoxical, but I think it makes sense. The idea that our reason alone, or our biological nature alone, or our feelings alone, the feelings we share with all human beings, that could tell us enough about what makes for a good life. Over and over again, that's turned out not to be true. And indeed, when you look at some of the utopian universalist projects, like communism, to take an example, or the French Revolution's religion of reason, they often wound up being very oppressive, very dictatorial, totalitarian, and I think they had to be, because most people don't want to live that way. They don't find enough in the religion of reason. They need more than that. Now, that doesn't mean that particularism doesn't have its dangers. It has great dangers. We need a balance. We need a balance between the particular and the universal. That's why you need the way of the world and the way of the Jews. But both have dangers. If we say all that matters is our universal human nature, well, then someone will have to define what that is, and what matters about it. And usually that means that person will impose their ideology on everybody else.
Right. Okay, so last question, if I may.
Yes.
So I was just recently reading Fleischacker on this question of how do we make claims of justice against groups that are different than our own, based on their own particularity. And, I mean, as a postmodern religious Zionist, which feels like an oxymoron, but, it's an interesting question. He particularly raises the issue of, for example, female genital cutting. And so at what point do we say we will bracket our claims for universal human rights based upon honoring another group's particularity? How do we navigate that murky grounds as advocates for universal justice while understanding the relativity of morality for different cultures?
So I'm not a relativist.
Yeah.
I cut my teeth on working on this issue in the philosophical world, and I think there's more to relativism than philosophers tend to grant. That's to say, I think, as I said, particularity is important, different cultures is important, differences is wonderful. But there is a limit to the importance of difference, and certainly when it comes to ruining somebody's entire life or ability to experience sexual joy, that would seem to be when you hit up against these limits. I'm inclined to say that in the hard cases, you don't give up on your idea that they're of universal rights. You may change your method. And in fact, specifically with regard to the horrific issue of genital cutting, I remember, this is now about 20 years ago, there was an African activist in the U.S. Opposing genital cutting, which was part of her own community. But she also opposed the attempt to make it illegal. The response by the liberal community in the States was, we got to outlaw this. She says, no, you got to talk to people in their community. You got to use their terms. And I think that's the crucial thing to remember. If you're an outsider to the community, you have to understand that community first and talk in their terms to be able to change things. And I am optimistic enough to hope that most evil practices can be overturned within the community itself. Instead of coming from the outside and saying these people are barbaric and we'll just tell them not to do. But that doesn't mean you give up on your claims.
So you might, in theory, be supportive if there was a European claim to ban shechita, kosher slaughter, or circumcision, based upon their understanding that these were unethical. Even though they're so deeply intertwined with our particularity, you might not oppose their
No, I certainly would oppose it because once again, the legal ban is crude, imperialistic, and understanding. If people in Europe think that shechita
persuasion rather than legislation.
Yes,
essentially.
persuasion,
Yeah. Okay.
legislation,
Okay.
and with these kinds of efforts,
Yeah.
they often
Yeah.
generally come with
Yeah.
an agenda that shows that
Yeah,
it really
that's
isn't
right.
motivated
Yeah,
by
right,
decency.
right.
In the actual proposals to ban shechita, they mostly have also been wanting to ban halal, and when people want
Yeah,
to ban
that's right.
circumcision, it's not just the Jews; they want to also get the Muslims. And in both cases, it's very interesting that similar practices are not even considered for banning. Like
Yeah.
nobody says, well, we actually should ban meat eating,
Yeah.
or we should ban tattooing,
Right,
because
right,
that
right,
hurts
right.
the human body.
Yeah, right,
But
right.
just ban
Yeah,
circumcision,
yeah,
not
right,
tattooing.
right. Yeah, exactly.
And that makes you think, well, maybe you should look in the mirror a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you should check your privilege.
Yeah.
So certainly when a more powerful group, a dominant group, says to a minority group,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
oh, we think you're
Yeah.
doing something wrong, they should stop and
Yeah.
think about it. And
Yeah.
if we move to persuasion rather than legislation, then I think there's more of an opportunity to work out these issues in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
One of the great thinkers of our time who is grappling deeply with Jewish thought and religious studies and moral philosophy. Incredibly prolific. Check out these wonderful works. We'll link to it down below. Thanks so much for this time.